Fáilte Rash McCarja. In the last episode, we looked at the importance of names of sports clubs in particular in the GAA context, Cumulú Class Gael, and we looked at some of the most unusual or the more unusual names, and we looked also at the mythology that surrounds some of the names, both in past and present GAA clubs. And in this particular episode of Corja, we're not only going to go over the seas, but we're going to go into different codes. From the early GAA clubs that spread into England, Scotland and Wales, right through to soccer, association football, and the influence that the Irish had on the growing game in Britain. So Corja Fáilte wrote Undercover Irish, whether you're part of the great diaspora abroad or you're at home, Sigi Shear, put your feet up, relax and enjoy this episode of Undercover Irish. A Corja, a Reigling La Céla. Corda, so far we've looked at names of GAA clubs in Ireland and sometimes beyond as well, based around mythology or maybe the more unusual rebellious names like slashers and rapparees. And I want to use the next example, which is still a GAA club, but to segue deliberately overseas and onto different codes. So when researching this particular episode, I was looking into diaspora names. And there's a context to an awful lot of this. So we're currently in a situation where the GAA is growing overseas as a result of the last kind of 20 years and previous of emigration from Ireland. And this growth seems to be happening or is mainly happening in places like Australia and New Zealand, Singapore, West Asia and North America as well, Canada in particular. But of course, this isn't something new. It might be a new wave, but this is something that would have happened in the 1800s and the early 1900s as well. So looking at this particular topic, I found myself seeing GAA clubs pop up in the history books and the newspaper archives around this time in England, in Scotland, and in Wales as well. And the names that they tended to take mirrored the names at home. You had the Saints, you have the Patriots. In some places you've got things like Manchester Martyrs, GAA, which would have been a very, very explicit expression of Irish nationalism within England in particular, around about Manchester, around about Liverpool. But the context to this, of course, is the sheer volume of numbers of people that were forcibly expelled from Ireland through economic means or through other means of starvation and hunger as a political weapon as part of the colonial project. And Liverpool in particular, Larfel, saw an absolutely massive influx of Irish refugees during Ungurta Mór, Drogheda and shortly afterwards. To put this into context, the Corja, we have to look at the sheer volume of numbers. So during Black 47, the worst year of Ungurta Mór, 100,000 Irish people arrived in Liverpool alone, just in that 1 year. Now, not all of them were staying in Liverpool. Many of them moved on across England and up into Scotland as well. And many of them, Liverpool was a staging post for the next section of their journey, heading to Canada and North America. Over the course of the 10 years between 1845 and 1855, 300,000 Irish migrants arrived in Liverpool, and by 1851, about 25% of Liverpool's population was Irish born. Now within that you had a massive amount of Irish speakers as well, because that was generally the people who had to flee from Ungurta Mór. So out of a total population of about 375,000 in Liverpool in 1851, you're talking about almost, 22 to 25% of the population being Irish born. And the vast majority of them, when they arrived there, were destitute. Liverpool was described as the second capital of Ireland. 38% of the population in Liverpool lived in cellar dwellings. And this was even higher in what became known as the Irish district, or the Irish district. So 50% of the arrivals in 1847 were completely destitute. And if you imagine the influence that this has on a city, it is massively influential in terms of the accent, in terms of community relationships, in terms of the names that become stitched into the community through sporting organisations. And in Liverpool, to GAA spread its wings, I suppose. Just to give you 3 hurling clubs around this time present in Larfield in Liverpool. You have Law of Darragh, the Red Hand, so we're going back to the Red Hand of Ulster, the Red Hand associated with O'Neill. You have Young Ireland again, a rebellious group. The Young Irelanders were involved in the uprising of 1848. But the one that really takes my interest and is a bit more unusual is diaspora ó Éireann. Diaspora ó Éireann. So essentially exiles, or more accurately outcasts from Ireland. So they became known as exiles in the English version of it, but diaspora ó Éireann. This really tells us something. It's an expression that this particular group of people resented being removed from their own country. And in this name, they remember that, the fact that they feel like they were outcast from Ireland. Diaspora ó Éireann. A really powerful name. And now, Corja, we switch codes a little bit, because this wasn't unusual in England or Scotland to have Irish clubs or clubs with Irish influences springing up left, right and centre. And if we stay with Liverpool, Larfield for just a second, looking through the 1880s and the 1890s, in the local football league. So you're talking about the Liverpool and District Alliance League, the Liverpool and District Amateur League. You're talking about non-league in terms of soccer or association football. Irish immigrants found their way into this particular sphere of sport as well. So in Liverpool alone, you had Celtic, Celtic Rovers, Celtic Swifts, Liverpool Celtic, Liverpool Hibernian, and the Saints take their name as well, or take their place as well. You have St. Anthony's, St. Francis Xavier, St. Sylvester's, all appearing in non-league. And there's also Fifth Irish, which comes from probably a more pro-British tradition than the previous ones. And what we see there is the Irish diaspora in Liverpool, and this is echoed in other cities like Manchester and indeed London around England, taking part and taking play in a game, association football, that is exploding in terms of popularity. Now, people say, politics and sport should be kept separate. But this particular explosion that's happening in England at the time, and indeed in Scotland and Wales, is very much linked to politics or political activity, because the fact that all of these clubs are springing up in the mid to late 1800s is a direct consequence of trade unionism, trade union struggle. So the struggles of workers to win more leisure time and less hours at work and more days off. And it's against this backdrop that you have a massive explosion in the formation of football clubs, particularly and especially in working class areas. Up to that point, a lot of sport in England is the reserve of the privately educated, or the public schools as they call it. Whereas at this moment in time, there's an explosion thanks to the agitation and the advances of trade unionism, which allows working class people access to sports and organisations of sports for the first time en masse in this particular type, or this particular style of sport at least. But there is an obvious question. So some people might be preempting where I'm going next in terms of when I mentioned Liverpool Hibernian and Liverpool Celtic. So in the next segment, we're going to look at Scotland. But there is a question as to why these clubs remained at non-league level and didn't achieve the successes of the clubs that I'm going to mention in Scotland. In a crowded field, I suppose, the success of Liverpool and the success of Everton didn't necessarily leave any opening for a third strong club in the city beyond Tranmere Rovers close by. But also the Catholic hierarchy within Liverpool were more inclined to assimilate, or to ask their flock, if you like, to assimilate. In fact, there's a really interesting aspect of that in the sense that there was Irish speakers within Liverpool for the first 1 or 2 generations after Ungurta Moore in that period. And rather than service them with Irish-speaking priests, they insisted on slowing that process down to ensure that the Irish within the city assimilated as best as possible. North of that border, north of Hadrian's Wall, going up into Alban, into Scotland, there was also a massive influx of Irish refugees, Irish migrants fleeing the famine, Ungurta Moore, and looking for a better chance in life, in particular on the west of Scotland. And we see it in obvious terms. When we look back now, we think of Celtic, the Celtic Football Club. But there would be no Celtic Football Club in Glasgow had there not been Hibernian Football Club in Edinburgh. Founded in 1875 in the Cowgate area of Edinburgh. This is a club that carries a name, a colour and a badge, which represents the members of Edinburgh's Irish community. The name itself, Hibernian, comes from the Latin name for Ireland. It's a green shirt. It usually has a harp on it over the course of the history of the club. And it was Hibs or Hibernian's success in the Scottish Cup that led to the formation of Celtic in an indirect way. Having won the Cup in Glasgow, that particular night, rather than returning to Edinburgh, the club and those associated with the club celebrated in Glasgow because, of course, Glasgow had a massive Irish population, particularly in the East End, the Calton, the Garngod area of the city. And it was then that they threw down the mantle to the Irish in Glasgow to form their own club, something that was taken up by Brother Walfrid and a number of others, including former Fenians. And a club, Celtic, was formed with a social purpose in mind, a specific social movement or social purpose in mind. And that was to put food on the dinner tables of the starving Irish in the East End of Glasgow. And throughout Glasgow and Edinburgh at junior level and lower level in soccer or in association football, there are many clubs over the generations and over the years that have carried Irish names with them as well, similar to Liverpool. But while Hibernian in Edinburgh and Celtic in Glasgow are well known and widespread and world famous, and their Irish connection very, very obvious in terms of name and colour scheme, there are also other clubs in Scotland that owe their lineage to Irish history. As an example of this, let's look at the city of Dundee. So if we go to Dundee, there was a club called Dundee Harp, founded in 1879 by Irish immigrants. And most of them were actually from County Tipperary, County Tubradoran. Like many harp clubs across Britain, the name symbolised Irish identity and nationalism. And they actually have an unusual, close to being a record score of beating Aberdeen 35-0 in the Scottish Cup in 1879 to 1880. The Irish identity was deeply tied to Dundee's Irish Catholic community. They played at a ground called Temple Lane, but financial struggles led to their decline and dissolution in 1894. But Dundee Harp represents the first wave of that particular phenomenon in Dundee city, but not the last. Because if you had Hibernians in Edinburgh, you too had Dundee Hibernian in Dundee. This club was founded in 1909. and it was created to serve Dundee's Irish Catholic population, the same way that Hibernian did in Edinburgh. Hibernian, as I said, means Irish or Ireland in Latin, so it's a clear signal of ethnic and cultural roots. And they played their home games at Tannadice. And if that's familiar to you, it tells the rest of the story. Because the club collapsed financially but was reborn in 1923 after a takeover. And in order to broaden its appeal, it was rebranded as Dundee United F.C. So today, currently, Dundee has Dundee F.C. and Dundee United, but Dundee United has its roots in Dundee Hibernian. And in all of those examples, Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee, the clubs would be tied to the immigrant population which live close together in slum areas, the east end of Glasgow, the Cowgate in Edinburgh and Lochee in Dundee. Now, Carja, I mentioned the importance of the trade union agitation winning better rights and in particular more leisure time for workers. The importance of that and its link to the growth of organised sport right across Britain and in Ireland as well. And while the names of some of the clubs that I've discussed reflect ethnicity, reflect a nationalism, a loyalty even, most clubs, and many of which we know now, at the time took their name directly from that work, that tradition of factory workers or labour, the labour movement. So Arsenal FC, for example, is named after the Royal Arsenal Munitions Factory in Woolwich. West Ham United began as Thames Ironworks FC, hence the nickname the Irons. They were formed by shipbuilders and iron workers. Manchester United started its life as Newton Heath FC, created by railway depot workers. Millwall is associated with dock workers and mill workers in London. An interesting one in Sheffield. Sheffield obviously is the steel city, known for creating or the manufacture of steel. Sheffield Wednesday took its name from the traditional workers' day off, Wednesday being the name of the day off. And so we see in the names of these clubs the expression of the work-life balance, if you like. This was the workers of Britain coming around, forming their own clubs, being part of an association and using their leisure time as a social outing, or a sporting outing, I should say. And I use this to segue back to Ireland because before we left Ireland at the start of this episode, we were focused solely on GAA clubs. But in Ireland, in terms of soccer association football, you also see a similar tradition in terms of the names of clubs. So while, again, many of them will take the names of places, place names, some of them originate from work and industry. Founded in 1902, you have St. James's Gate FC. Now, St. James's Gate is familiar to you from some advert campaign. Of course, it's linked with the Guinness Brewery, and this is a classic example of a work-based team at St. James's Gate Brewery in Dublin. Similarly, you had Jacobs FC, founded in 1910, and this is linked to the Jacobs Biscuit Factory in my own city of Cork. For a period of time, the top team representing Cork in the League of Ireland was Ford Sons FC, founded in 1921, Ford Sons Football Club. And this was linked to the Ford Motor Factory, the Ford Motor Company, which had a Cork plant in the city. And this was one of the most successful Irish factory teams. It later became Cork FC. So what we have there is an example of a factory team, or a team which comes from work and industry and then evolves into a club with a broader name. And this is exactly the same thing we see with Dundalk FC. Founded in 1903 as Dundalk GNR, Great Northern Railway. This was formed by railway workers, and it's a clear Irish equivalent to what we see with the railway clubs in England in particular. And while many Irish soccer clubs, football clubs take similar names or second names to what you see in England in terms of Wanderers, Rovers, Ramblers, United, City, Town, In Ireland, there are some exceptions, not least Bohemians in Dublin, Treaty United in Limerick. I love that name. Named after the Treaty Stone, something we've discussed on previous podcast episodes. And of course, up north, Crusaders, named after Christian medieval knights. And it's not just at the top level that you see these unique names. In fact, at the bottom level or junior level or lower level, you're more likely to see an unusual name. Like, for example, Freebooters F.C, Pegasus, or Corinthians. Shinawilla Corja, that's it for what is the second episode in what's becoming a bit of a mini-series to do with names and their power, what they carry, what they remember, and how we can still learn from looking at them and using them as a thread, as I always kind of like to think, a thread that we can pull to reveal the history, the identity, the belonging from one particular thing. In this case, we've looked at names. And in this episode, we went across to Larfel. We went across and we followed in the steps of those who fled before, during and after Ungurtamore to see the influence that they had in shaping not just their own sports abroad, but other sports as well. Coming up on the next episode or two of this particular mini-series, we'll be looking at class and how class plays a role in sport and how sport plays a role in class. We'll be looking at other sports from basketball to rugby, a couple of more unusual ones in the GAA and a couple of more soccer ones from not just overseas but different continents, in fact. So, Corja, gur míle magat osach film seo. If you've enjoyed this episode and you enjoy this particular podcast, please do consider supporting on Patreon or Patreon. My sincere thanks to those people who do support the show's upkeep and overheads. Gur míle magat Corja for the encouragement and the support. It's absolutely massively appreciated. And to all of you who listen to this, Corja gur míle magat osach film. Thank you so much for being in my company. It's much appreciated. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Until the next one, Corja, gur míle magat agus berigi bua fan slán slán go fór.